Hey, good afternoon, everyone in Business Law 2. I know some of the students like to see a video of me talking about some of the topics in the class and hopefully to clarify some of the points in the text. Um, I'm going to put up a brief summary of the chapters as we go forward, but I can tell you that on some of the more technical chapters, there's quite frankly better presentations already made out there on YouTube and in other academic um, uh, areas that I can use through license and copyright permission that I often seek, because quite frankly, they just do a better job and they present the information much better. But nonetheless, to make the class feel a little bit more personable and more connected to the mount, me and you, I thought at least put up some thoughts about each chapter as we go forward, especially the first 5 chapters of Business Law 2, chapters 21 through 25, which deals with commercial instruments, or what we call now negotiable instruments. In my day, I was in law school right at the time they changed the Uniform Commercial Code. I believe it's Section 3. Or Article 3. We have different articles dealing with different sections of things related to commercial transaction, business transaction, contract law. And Article 3 deals with negotiable instruments, which we used to call commercial paper. And I was just recently looking at my transcript from law school when the class I took was called commercial paper. They won't call it that anymore. They might call it a class on Article 3, or they might call it a class on negotiable instruments. But they mean the same thing, and we still use that kind of language synonymously between negotiable instruments and commercial paper. Just over time, we decided to create a uniformity in some of the vocabulary. And that's what chapter 20, perhaps more than anything else, is about: vocabulary. It does get confusing. Thank goodness it's open book, open no test. But over time, you do hopefully get more comfortable with the different identities of the different actors involved with a negotiable instrument. Why do we care about negotiable instruments? Because not everything's done with cash. Although we've come a long way in terms of electronic fund transfers, that's really revolutionized and limited, really, the necessity to, I should say the necessity to understand, but we have come a long way. Cash is almost, I don't want to say disappeared, but in terms of my own life experience, we don't use cash nearly as much as we used to. And we don't use checks, which is a form of negotiable instruments, or promissory notes in paper form the way we once did. We do much more of it electronically. Let's go through what negotiation is. So there is usually a person that is making an unconditional promise to pay a sum certain, a very certain amount of money. Although you can have interest attached, because as long as it can be computed accurately in terms of how much money will be actually owed, that's fine too. And it has to be payable at a date certain or upon demand. That's called a sight draft. Same thing as a payable on demand note or payable on demand draft, the same thing. Drafts means checks. When you hear drafts, it's usually a check, because it's requiring a third party involved to basically pay. So if I write you a check, I just picked up mine here, for example. That's for some reason it's upside down because I'm looking at the camera. But you write a check out. I am the drawer. I am the one making out the check. When I sign down on the bottom, a lot of people say you endorse the check. When you say endorse, that usually relates to the back of the check. That's when the person who has been issued to actually endorses so that they can negotiate it to a third party. The original check, say you came over and I don't know, I bought my car from you. I bought your car from you. Backwards there. So I write out a check. It's a terrible car, so I'm going to write it out for $5,000. And well, I guess it's not that bad a car. So I write it out to $5,000. I am the drawer of the check. I am ordering Bank of America to pay whom? You. Let's say it's Joe Smith. To you, to pay to the order of Joe Smith. That means it's order paper. If it just said payable to cash or payable to bearer, then it's bearer paper, and then anybody who possesses it can cash it. Now, initially, if I said Joe Smith doesn't present it to me for payment, at least at that juncture. In later chapters, we might learn that if the drawee is the Bank of America, refuses to pay it for some reason, I may have something called secondary liability as the drawer. The payee is just that, Joe Smith, you're the payee. This is not yet negotiated. A lot of people think by me giving them the check and signing it and delivering it to them, that's a negotiated instrument. No, it's an instrument requiring payment in lieu of cash. or in lieu of, and people do not have to accept checks. Legal tender is the only way that's binding in most contracts. But practically speaking, in order to carry on business, we have to be able to do electronic fund transfers, and we have to be able to do negotiable instruments. So you're Joe Smith, you got the check. Now what are you going to do? Well, you might go to the bank it's drawn from, the drawee, and demand payment because it's a site draft, right? You go there and you get the money. But what if, for example, it's not convenient for you? Well, what you could do is go to your bank, and what is your bank going to make you do? Now the term is endorsement. When I signed on the front, that's a signature. When you sign on the back, that's an endorsement. Now when you sign on the back, usually you leave it blank. That's called a blank endorsement. We'll get into the later chapters of different kinds of endorsements on the back. But when you sign it on the back, it now becomes bearer paper, unless before you signed it, you said pay to the order of Sandollar Bank or something like that. If you just sign the back, it's now bearer paper, turn it over to your bank. They'll either give you the funds or put your funds in your account. It gets a little complicated as we go through the different steps in liability in later chapter. But initially, why do we care about this stuff? Well, we care about it because we want to learn about the liability of me as the drawer, the potential liability of the drawee, the bank, and then you, the payee, may develop certain liability, believe it or not, later on if you endorse it and negotiate it on to other parties as we go. And the videos that I put up, I think, are much better than anything I'm going to explain because of my scatterbrain technique of teaching. And if I was in a classroom, I could draw some things up. And we used to do drills in the classroom. I'd make out a model check or a fake check like this to you, and then we'd go over and go, who's that person now? They're payee. Who am I? I am the drawer. Who is the bank? They are the drawee. And now we're going to transfer to different people in the class, and they are the what? The person who was originally the payee becomes the endorser. They now negotiated it to the third party. And certain things have to exist for the document to be a negotiable instrument. That comes up in a later chapter. There's usually 8 specific requirements. Some have reduced it down and combined a couple of the elements, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Why do we care about this stuff even more importantly? Because between me and Joe Smith, the liability seems clear, and so does the party relationships are clear. But what if Joe Smith's in the defenses? So maybe later he tries to demand payment, and there's certain defenses to it, like maybe the car turns out to be broken down and it breached some quality, so I might be able to put a stop payment on a check. Those are potential defenses to payment by the payee potentially. Those defenses may not be necessarily available to this next party. So Joe Smith, for example, endorses it, signs on the back, and gives it to somebody he owes $5,000 to. So instead of, hey, I know you owe $5,000, Corman just wrote me a check for $5,000, let me endorse it over to you. Say they know me or something, so they trust it. Never trust paper till you get the cash, right? But they endorse it, they give it to third party. Now, if they paid value for it and they know of no known defenses, they're called a holder in due course. They bought it basically in good faith. And then they try to go and demand payment. The defenses that may have been made to the original payee, Joe Smith, may not be raised against Jane Doe now. Jane Doe, as a holder in due course, gets special status, and her ability to enforce payment on the negotiable instrument is much higher. And that's what makes negotiable instruments valuable. That's why banks alone is often a type of negotiable instrument. It's called a promissory note. And banks often do well with their promissory notes. They often sell them to third parties in the third party a mortgage market, because that's what we call mortgages, but they're really promissory notes. Those promissory notes are usually negotiable instruments. And the buyers of those will become what? Holder in due courses, because they paid value. They know of no known defenses to it. And then when they try to collect, some of the defenses that might have been available against the original bank or mortgage company won't be available against the bearer now. It just won't be available. So order paper versus bearer paper, you guys mostly know this. It says it already on most pre-printed checks, pay to the order of. And now if I say Joe Smith, that's order paper. But if I say pay to the order of cash or pay to the order of bearer, it's bearer paper. What's the difference? On bearer paper, anybody that possesses it can cash it. In theory, it's supposed to be delivered to them voluntarily. If somebody came in my office and I had it written out to cash and they pick it up and go cash it, that's a fraudulent act. But generally speaking, it is just like a fraudulent act if they came in and took cash off my desk. Be very cautious about writing things out the cash and then signing. Don't call it an endorsement on the front. On the front is a signature. That's authorizing the drawee bank to honor it. So be very cautious about writing things out to cash or to holder or bearer, those that turn. That's what my father used to say, and he was right. It turns the document into cash. And how do you? It could be transferred to multiple people down the line without any form of endorsement on the back. And why do the banks want endorsement on the back? Because if things go awry later on, not only does the original drawer, me, have potential liability to make that bank whole, but the other endorsers along on the back have secondary liability. We'll get to that in a later chapter. So negotiation paper, bearer paper, of the classification drafts, promissory notes, commonly for purposes of class, to keep it simple. There are different kinds of drafts, but the most common is forms of checks. Promissory notes, IOUs. And there's a nice little example in the book. They usually spell out to whom something's paid, if there's interest, when is it payable. And you have to have all those details. We're going to learn later in a later chapter. To be a negotiable instrument, it does have to require it to be in writing. It has to be an unconditional promise to pay a fixed amount or amount that can be ascertained very easily, not through any kind of speculation. So if it says plus 6% interest, we know we can figure out the amount at any given time, even if it's an immediate demand note, because they don't demand it until 30 days, so much interest will require. It'll be considered a negotiable instrument through all those things. We know who the payee is. That's the person being paid. The drawer is the person who's I'm taking out of this my checkbook. I am the drawer. The drawee is going to be the bank. This is only for drafts. The acceptor, this one throws people off. The terms, open book, take your time, keep going over, reread the chapters, but the acceptor is going to be the bank. And so I gave this to Joe Smith, and let's assume Joe decided not to negotiate it to a third party other than his bank. But when he goes to the bank, he'll present it. It's called presentment, and the bank will either do what? Accept, and they literally have a stamp, an acceptance stamp, or they'll reject it for whatever reason, lack of funds, or there's some other issue going on. The IRS has a hold on my account. When it comes to promissory notes, or IOUs, I like to use because most people can think of those a little bit more clearly. And there's an example in the book too. There's the maker. I promised to pay my father and sister. My sister's kind of an entrepreneur, but my father always, even though he was a simple guy, always seemed to have money, a little bit of money, like modest amounts. My sister always needed like $5,000 to rehab some house she bought and was going to rent out, and so she was constantly borrowing money from my dad. And my sister, being a businesswoman, would want to write up a loan. And after I went to law school, they asked me to review it. And they always wanted like a legal paper, real fancy. It doesn't have to be fancy at all, but it would literally be, I, Patricia Corman. And careful, I shouldn't say careful. You should date things. You should give as much information as possible, but you don't want a lot of legal terminology in there. You just want clarity. And so the lack of a date does not affect negotiability. The lack of a date payable could. If there's no date on it when it's payable, it's called the demand or site draft or site note, and it has to be payable upon demand. But my sister would write something up like, I, Patricia Corman, owe Joseph Corman Sr. $5,000 on this date, payable though on this other date. And my sister used to pay my father interest because he liked to keep his money in his bank, and the bank would never give him much interest. My sister would give him a little bit more, so it would be attractive. Now, what's interesting about that, now my dad would be what? Not only is my dad the payee, but he's the holder of that promissory note. And because it's a negotiable instrument paid to the order of Joseph Corman Sr., what could my dad have done? He could have endorsed it, or he could have assigned it. And that's what we're going to get to in a minute. Well, I guess it's right there in a second, but the differences. So holder, that's the person that possesses the document. Bearer, that's the same thing. It's the one that possesses it, and it's payable to cash, though. Holder in due course, that's the special status that we'll talk about in a later chapter about you pay money or some value is exchanged. You come to possess the negotiable instrument through endorsement, and you know of no known defenses or anything like that. You get a special status so that when you go to demand collection, you go to demand payment, certain defenses can't be raised against you that could have been raised against the original party. And that's the big thing with an assignment. You can always assign different kinds of legal paper obligations that don't necessarily meet negotiability, because maybe there's all kinds of conditional promises in there. There's any kind of conditional promise. It's not a negotiable instrument, but it could still be an enforceable contract. Can any contract be assigned the rights? Those of you who took business law with me, you can assign rights, right? And so you assign the right. You can assign the right to anything that's a right, meaning to collect money, but you can't always negotiate a written exchange value. In order to negotiate, it has to meet the 8 requirements of what a negotiable instrument means, and it has to be what? It has to be endorsed or be bearer paper. An assignment only gives you the rights that the original possessor had. A negotiation gives you greater rights and protections to potentially collect the debt. That's the main thing I think I want to drive out of this chapter. And I know I'm explaining it terribly. Credit and collection, I'm not so concerned about the difference between those. Electronic fund transfers, the one thing I want to do talk about that. I've noticed lately I haven't written a check for a long time. My mortgage is paid automatically out of my bank through electronic fund transfers, pre-authorized debits. And so is my salary from the Mount is paid through a pre-authorized credit to me. And it helps because it actually speeds up the time you get the money, but you also don't have to do a presentment to get it accepted. It's much more easily done. It's also nicer to keep track of everything, I think, for the paper trail. The other thing, too, is if there's an electronic fund transfer that's fraudulent, as long as you get prompt notice, and I think the statute is 50 days, just says very prompt. I know there's a statutory time. I think it's like a month. But whatever it is, as long as you as the victim of an electronic funds transfer that wasn't authorized gives notice to the bank that it's not authorized, you do not have to eat this. If someone stole your identity or somehow got a hold of your, the routing and number of your ETF card, you can basically recoup all of that money. And even if you didn't, there's sometimes a cap of $50 liability against you, which is a wonderful thing. And I've had this happen to me before. One day I noticed I bought something off eBay, and literally a week later I noticed I got like 2.99 charges on my debit card. I don't remember those, but I said maybe it's something part of the thing I did with eBay. And about 2 days later I got like 17 or 18.99 charges, and then then it was going up to like $1.99, and it was all within like a week time. Then all of a sudden they're like $5.99, and it was getting up into the hundreds of dollars total. And so I immediately contacted my bank. They said, yeah, that looks very, very suspicious. They credited my account all that money back. I didn't lose a penny. And of course, they issued me new cards and things like that. The irony of it is now I get paranoid. I check that's why it's important always to check your ETF, basically your bank account, any electronic transfers of money going in and out, always check it. Same with credit cards. And I was checking it, and about a month went by, so now I'm really probably paranoid. And I see that someone's buying pizza beer at a pub in Boston, a couple, I don't know, maybe close to $100. And I'm like, I wasn't in Boston. I said, what the heck is this? And I don't even know the name of this restaurant. I looked it up on the web and I see what it is. I'm like, oh my God. So I called the bank. I said, something happened again. I don't know who they got a hold of it. So they put a stop payment on that too, recouped all that money. It wasn't a problem. And then about, I feel terrible about this, but about a month later, I'm sitting with my daughter, who at the time was living in Boston. And she says, oh, I accidentally, because I had used your credit card for something else a few months later, it got saved in my Apple thing or something. It was basically, she was using it accidentally. So I called the bank because I felt terrible. I said, well, that was actually an authorized charge. And they said, okay, but they never took it back out. So I feel a little guilty about that. My daughter got free pizza and beer in Boston. I probably would have been free anyways because it came out of my account. She wasn't going to probably pay me back. But anyways, electronic fund transfer, check truncation. All that means is back in the old days, if I wrote this check, gave it to you, and once you cashed it or negotiated it, it would come back to me physically saying this was paid on a certain date just to give me evidence of it. We don't really do that anymore, so it's all check truncation. All truncation means is they don't have to physically give me the check back. They'll just show in my account in some electronic form that it was in fact accepted and honored on a certain date. And they might show me a picture of the check, which I do like to see because sometimes I can't remember. $450. Who did I write a check? Oh, geez, that's right. I did it for this. And I like to see the check. My bank account does it. I don't think they have to in most agreements anymore because it's truncation is to aid the process by which accounts are resolved in terms of their outstanding amounts of money. Pre-authorized debits and credits, already mentioned that. Automatic teller machines, same thing. I think the questions at the end of the chapter are going to help you dig in and say, what does that mean again? I thought I understood it, but now that I have to actually look it up. You write out those simple answers. You put them up on Blackboard for me. And especially the end of chapter questions. The case problems I know can be a real pain in the neck because you're saying, what are they really looking for here? Not quite understanding what the question is, but it's obviously related to the material in the chapter. Try to do the best you can in case problems. Those of you who had me for Business Law 1 know that when it comes to case problems, I don't expect you sometimes even to understand what they're looking for. Just make a good faith attempt to answer those questions and you get credit for those anyways. And it really does help you understand the context of what this stuff means. Read or watch those other videos I put up. I don't put them up there just to waste my time. I put them up there because I watch them and it helps solidify my understanding of the commercial paper documents as well. I can tell you, those of you that think this is a drag, it is. It's technical stuff. The first 5 chapters that we're going to review, chapter 20 through 25, is going to be not too much fun. Unless you love this stuff, it gets much better with the other material. And so if you kind of, I don't want to say if you flounder on the exam related to this module, don't worry about it. But I recognize it's difficult stuff. And unless you're out there practicing as a banker or involved in business and dealing with checks, it takes a little time to get a sense of what all these terms and identities are of the different parties as we go forward. But try to have fun with it. Again, I try to be as liberal as possible in terms of the expectations, knowing that it takes a little time to really let this stuff sink in. It's not a lack of intellectual ability or anything like that, but it's dry. It often sounds like a foreign language to people that have never been exposed to it in the past. But it's important stuff to learn, at least the basic concepts and the identities of the parties. Eventually, the material will sink in, if not during the class, but in life when you're out there doing things in business and the rest. Otherwise, be well.